Okay, good morning, everybody. We are continuing the conference with our second day, and I have the honor to introduce. I don't have to introduce her, but still, I would like to introduce Emily Apter. Emily Apter is a Julius Silver Professor of French and Comparative Literature and chair of the Department of French Literature, Thought and Culture at New York University. And I really appreciate that you accepted the invitation and are going to give us a plenary talk. Emily Apter studied at Harvard and Princeton, where she earned her PhD on comparative literature. She's the editor of the book series Translation from Princeton University Press, and she's the author, of course, of numerous books. And I would like to mention just two of them, which is the first one is Unexceptional Politics on Obstruction, Impasse, and the Impolitic from 2018, and Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability 2013. So, Professor Apter, dear Emily, please. Thank you.
So, does this work with a little arrow this way?
Yes, it should work.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. I would like to give a collective round of thanks to Lydia Ritz for the incredible organization of this conference and for inviting me and for making it such a wonderful occasion for all of us. So, thank you. So let me get started. The American translator and writer Lydia Davis may not be well known to everyone in this audience. Born in 1947 and married for many years to the writer Paul Auster, Davis has been duly acclaimed in the Anglophone world of letters, both for her elegant translations of Madame Bovary and Swann's Way, and for her narrative experiments in micro-récits, which anticipated, some have said, the fashion in flash fiction. Short, very short. Her collected stories offer narrative experiments that traverse the line between literature and translation, because typically her narrator protagonists are translators whose musings on the work, on the labor of translation, occupy a central place in her literary writings. And I'll be saying more about this. Davis recently donated her archive to Columbia University's manuscript collection. And in what follows, I will attempt to build a case for the secret life of translation based on fragments and letters that I found in her archive. A pathos-infused yellow little post-it note appended to a revised copy of Davis's Proust translation manuscripts reads, "Stopped entering corrections here to meet deadline." Another note, this is just how it looks. Excuse the terrible slides, they were done from my own work. Appended to a letter contains a to-do list of translation tasks. I treated this paratextual material as testaments to the temporal and material constraints that impinge on the determination of when the process of translation ends or not. They attest to the translator's human presence, and though translators register their presence by appending footnotes or glossaries in published translations, they're generally discouraged by editors from reminding readers that what they are reading is a translation. The reasons for this are mostly commercial, as you know. Readers want frictionless access to the authentic voice of the author, uninterfered with by a mediator. Accordingly, a translation is judged good if its prose flows, if it appears true to the original, aligned with the source text to the point of becoming invisible. This ideal of true translation is best fulfilled by machine translation, where accuracy is optimized by algorithmically corrective software. As anyone who has recently put a text into DeepL, ChatGPT, or Google Translate discovers, the result, at least these days, is surprisingly accurate and fast, as if a live interpreter were standing by to perform simultaneous translation in real time. This effect of hyper-fidelity, coupled with immediacy, the new gold standard of a translation's truth, stands in contrast to the varied norms adopted by human translators. With machine translation, traces of the hard labor of translation get washed away. The arduous process of decision-making, word weighing, error acknowledgement, all this is effectively erased. Machine translation offers a pasteurized outcome, artificially flavored to the extent that it is a product of artificial intelligence. It has no history. It's a technologically mediated artifact, reliant on data scraping, predictive processing, and synthetic derivatives of the labor of others. Human translation is less telos-driven and shaped by philosophies of translation that produce variegated truths. Perusing Lydia Davis's archive presents us with different truths, while providing a snapshot of what I would call the work of literature in the age of mechanical translatability. This, of course, being a play on the English rendering of the famous Walter Benjamin title, The Work of Art in the Age of Reproducibility. Now, this period, I would say, spans roughly the mid-1990s to the mid-2000s, when translation practice was already being radically transformed by advances in translation technology, but not yet fully beholden to LLMs, large language models, and outsourced intelligence. Davis's margin notes and correspondence speak to a kind of last moment before the last, a moment when notes to self and files of painstaking revisions amount, I would suggest, to a kind of secret biography of translation, or a secret autofiction, if one recalls how often she transfers some of this private material directly into her literary writing. Here she's describing the consultation process of different dictionaries. A large portion of Davis's fiction is written from the point of view of a first-person narrator who happens to be a translator by profession. But soon we realize that this protagonist is less a real person than a particular kind of consciousness, sensitive to words, constantly thinking between languages, like many of us do. She lives in a mental space in which lexical choices and literal meanings are motivators of the plot lines and descriptions in the fiction. This genre might be thought of as cognitive realism. Davis reveals how the translator's thinking process bears on something intimate and personal, perhaps not fully confessional, but auto-fictional, to the degree that moods, affects, and biorhythms associated with acts of translating are registered as literary style and cadence. Davis often, I'm not going to read this, but sorry. Davis often slows the pace of narration to a crawl so that it matches the incremental pace of mental and physical exertions required by translation. Word hunting, equivalence chasing, placeholding techniques when the right word fails to materialize, the feelings provoked by these actions. Thyroid Diary, for example, which I show you here, offers a blow-by-blow account of how translation labor yields a unique mode of writing. And you can see here, she says, I realize I don't understand the French, even after trying several times. I cast my eye listlessly here and there within the paragraph, hoping the meaning of it will fall into place by itself, which it sometimes does, but today it does not. And then my mind wanders, back to work on it, and so on and so forth. So you see, this is not her translation diary. This is her fiction. The confession, she says, that her mind may not be working very clearly, and that she may not know if her translation is good or not, lays bare in a very true-to-life manner a condition of what we would call translation anxiety. This anxiety is aggravated by economic anxiety. As we see in Davis's novel, this is one of her few novels, called The End of the Story. I've just finished translating a long autobiography written in a difficult style by a French ethnographer. It's Michel Leris, by the way. It's a good thing I'm done, because the longer I spend on the book, the less money I have. I will send it off to the publisher along with my bill and wait for my check to arrive. I went downstairs and explained to Vincent that I seemed to spend about $2,300 per month and had enough to last for about a year if I translated just a little. But Vincent reminded me that my calculations are often wrong. I often forget what he calls hidden costs. Part of it may be that translators are paid by the word. So the more carefully they work on a translation, the less they are paid for their time, which means that if they are very careful, they may not earn much. And often, the most interesting or unusual the book, the more painstaking they have to be. For one or two difficult books I took so long over each page, I earned less than $1 an hour. Similar nerve-wracking ratios of work pace to rate of pay bubble up from the notes and accounting scraps that one finds in the archive. Sifting through the manuscript and miscellaneous folders, I came across lists of expenditures and saved receipts, ledgers and payment schedules for translation work, a $6,000 figure awarded for a writing grant that together with translation payments will help offset a low bank balance. But translation does not really pay the bills. And it is this story, too, The Secret Life of Translation, that comes through in a letter like this one, which I found in one of the Proust folders from the Penguin Group assistant editor. Dear Lydia Davis, I'm sorry to report that due to a decrease in sales and a lack of demand over the past year, we find it necessary to reduce and sell off our overstock of inventory of Swan's Way, as provided for in your contract. The notice applies only to the edition listed. Paperback, of course, is alive and well. My point here is that the intellectual activity of translating, often rendered with X-ray granularity, is always brought down to earth by material concerns, time's money, and a massive amount of time spent on research questions, leaving translators vulnerable to this precarity. Consider how much time is spent on the finer points of certain words in this email from Davis, dated 2003, to a gardening expert, Derry Watkins. I love this one. I'm going to read it. Apropos la pointe d'un rayon, Proust. This is for the Proust people. Proust has this image, and the lack of accents is in the text. Comme la mésange balancée par la brise à la pointe d'un rayon, which I've translated as like a titmouse rocked by the breeze on the tip of a light. Now, I've heard from a British reader who suggests that even though lots of translators agree on interpreting rayon as ray of light, he thinks it might not be that, but rather the sort of ray one finds in the umbral of a plant, like the cow parsley. This would make more sense, really, he says. He sees titmice popping up and down on the ends of stalks of cow parsley, inflorescences out of his study window. My question to you is this: would you or any plant person refer casually to a ray in connection with an umbral or inflorescence? I've never heard this, but it does exist in dictionaries, especially as medullary ray. If I changed what I have, I probably would say stalk or flower head rather than ray. The reader suggests umbral stalk, which may be accurate, but a little too technical and clumsy. So what we see here are two possible worlds. One dealing with cosmic rays, the other with plant anatomy. They collide in translation. Inflorescence or cow parsley, medullary ray or flower head. There's an echo of the Proustian choice of paths, mes églises or guermantes. Another echo of Wittgenstein's perceptual undecidability between a duck and a rabbit. Resolving these mutually exclusive ways of translating a single word, reducing a plethora of possible meanings down to one, or down to a one that always is undecidable into two. Such operations belong to translation's problem-solving apparatus, an apparatus that generates so many speculative parameters and possible solutions that it becomes impossible to master its programs or maintain its work schedule. To mitigate such difficulties, translators rely on the free labor of others. Davis sends a query to Christopher Prendergast, the general editor of the Penguin edition. I have a question for which you could probably answer because your knowledge of French history is better than mine. I'm still correcting little trouble spots in the manuscript where Proust refers to courtiers and nobles petitioning the king at the Bain of an allée at Versailles. I translated allée as alley, which is apparently confusing. My question is, would the king be walking on a path at Versailles or being driven along an avenue when he was accosted by petitioners? Prendergast puts the question to Cambridge. He punts it to Cambridge scholar Peter Bailey. I don't know if you know Peter.
Did.
Okay, you can tell us afterwards. with a wonderful note. Peter, you looking over the shoulder of Saint-Simon, you will be able to answer this question. And he responds, and this is just wonderful. The allées at Versailles can still be seen. They are geometrically laid out avenues or rides, perhaps Midas stabs at the right word here, of terre battue, or fine gravel in the park behind the palace. You could walk along them, or you could be taken in a light carriage. There is somewhere a picture of Louis XIV at a certain age walking along one of them next to the carriage of Madame de Maintenon. Saint-Simon also describes such a scene, the king taking off his hat, putting his head inside the window to talk to his wife from time to time. Doubtless, from time to time, he too went in a carriage as the gangrene got worse, but not, I guess, on horseback. That was for military or hunting purposes away from the formal park. Whatever the manner of his conveyance, petitioners could easily get at him, and regularly did. So this goes on. But what I love at the end is he says, does this mean a free copy of the finished product? Bailey treats the translator to a lively disquisition not only on rides versus avenues, the layout of a formal garden, and the soft gravel as opposed to the hard cobblestones used to pave parks, but also to a kind of vision, a movie of Louis XIV in action, doffing his hat, chatting with Madame de Maintenon, heading off his petitioners. His animated gloss on Proust's snapshot of the regal past is indicative of the bartered erudition that scholars and translators trade in, part of an underground economy in which the best reward is a free copy of the finished product. If time is money, a lifetime of temps perdu and lost income can be measured in the controversy over how to translate the title of Proust's first volume, Du Côté de chez Swann. It reads like an episode in one of Davis's fictions. By way of swans, pretty well met the requirements. Sometime after it had settled in as a working title, two more possibilities came up. The Way by Swans, The Way by Swan's House. These are solid, comfortable titles, yet now the precious preposition was gone, as was the slightly breathy, rushed, fragmentary sound of the French. One last possibility was Along the Way by Swans, But in the end, it too seemed too cumbersome and restricted in meaning, and so the working title became the final choice. Perhaps in time it will become as familiar as another peculiar title, Flann O'Brien's At Swim Two Birds. Davis writes to Penguin's editor Simon Winder, patiently outlining all the reasons for preferring By Way of Swans to Swan's Way, and proposing the compromise of including the old title in parentheses, By Way of Swans, Swan's Way, in parallel with the Penguin solution for Kafka's America, which appeared in Michael Hoffman's translation as The Man Who Disappeared, America. Davis doesn't get anywhere. Winder is unconvinced. Then Prendergast enters the fray, siding in salty prose with Davis. You can see, I just put this up, it's a very long email. Well, Simon, what can one say? Swan's Way is inaccurate, misleading, a cultural fetish, perhaps based on some peculiarly English form of literary snobbery, which has Proust opening the way to the higher wisdom. But I agree entirely with Lydia that whatever its function in the English Proust cult, it has nothing to do with Proust's original. The case here lies strictly parallel with the early English fetish, deep resistance to abandon prettily Shakespearean remembrance of things past, which Proust detested. There's of course nothing sacred about By Way of Swans, but to claim that it is tortured is just plain silly. It's no odder either syntactically or lexically than Du Côté de chez Swann. The whole point is to claim something at the odds of the original. And so this is, I love the way British people go at it with each other. They don't spare any. In the end, I have to say when I first saw that By Way of Swans, I'm like, no, come on, it has to be Swan's Way. So I was in the wrong camp. In the end, a confusing resolution is found. The first British Penguin edition retains the working title, while the American edition reverts to the conventional Swan's Way. And my colleague up at Columbia, Susan Bernofsky, wrote to Davis, I was so disgusted when I walked into the bookstore and saw that the American edition of the Proust was back to the old title. I will tell everyone I run into that this isn't the right title. Flurry email concerns principles and philosophies of translation. Davis is a partisan of the literalist school. Given a choice between the perfectly accurate and more exact match to the French, she'll opt for the latter. And she makes this explicit in a wonderful an alphabet of Proust translation observations from Aurore to Zoot. Says, I was given license to make all the revisions I wanted to in preparation for the hardcover of Swan's Way, and again for the American paperback. It was at one of those points I realized I could change the perfectly good and accurate catastrophic deluge to a much closer replica of the French diluvian catastrophe, which I found delightful in its strangeness. But James Grieve, translator of In the Shadows of Young Girls in Flower, and prior to that, the author of a 1982 translation of Swan's Way, sets his principles in the opposite camp. His approach was not, according to Davis, was not to follow the original French as closely as possible, but Scott Moncrief's, and to study the text for its meaning, and then recreate it in a style which might have been that of an author writing originally in English. In a lengthy email, he would dispute Davis's criticism of his use of study. For Proust's plaquette, Davis proposes a small book. Oh, sorry, that's not it. And underscoring its status as a physical object. So my point is that these little mini these dramas, are always erupting. They get really angry, really upset. The Secret Life of Translation is full of these dramas, but it includes moments of pleasure. In 21 Pleasures of Translating and a Silver Lining, Davis notes the pleasure of thinking about how Flaubert's phrase, Ils s'en allaient ruminant son bonheur, comme ceux qui mâchent encore, après le dîner, le goût des truffes qu'ils digèrent. He would ride along, ruminating on his happiness like a man continuing to chew, after dinner, the taste of the truffles he's digesting. How this invites you to savor the question, I love this, of how you chew a taste. This is the discovery of translation as an enlivening experience, mining the triple play. And it made me think of a title of essays on translation that Gayatri Chakraborty-Spivak published called Living Translation, where that idea of living translation mines the triple play on living with translation, living in translation, and live translation, which vivifies life itself. And this is a funny one. Davis has something called Reading a Gunhild Oyang story in Norsk. Liveliness is sparked by a comedy of translation errors involving the pitfalls of teaching yourself a Norwegian dialect by simply reading it word by word, willing yourself to divine its contents with no foothold in sustained grammar study. The narrative features the translator enjoying herself at her own expense. First, in discovering, that's out of, yeah, there we are. Out of order, sorry. She discovers to her amusement she seems to have missed the murder in a crime story. Second was taking a shaving cream label for a toothpaste label, resulting in a slapstick scene that could be out of a Marx Brothers film. That evening in the hotel room, after making a different sort of linguistic mistake, having misunderstood the label on the slim tube of crema de Apter picked up on an earlier trip, I found myself brushing my teeth with shaving cream. I thought ahead to the translation seminar the next day. I probably mentioned to the eager students, as I always imagine them, how one language opens the door to another. Spanish to Portuguese, Dutch to Afrikaans, Norwegian to Danish, Swedish, Danish, Icelandic, and Faroese. I would probably not mention the shaving cream, the soapy taste of which still lingered in my mouth. So, Thesis 17 of the 21 Pleasures of Translating describes the pleasure derived from hearing readers who are grateful for your work. And this is the pleasure afforded the reader of the archive as well. I think in the interest of time, how are we doing for time? I'm going to just...
Is that a quarter of an hour?
Oh, okay. A missive from Herbert Morris, professor of philosophy and law at UCLA, poses a question to Davis about Proust's line, cette indifférence aux souffrances qu'on cause et qui quelques autres noms qu'on lui donne, et la forme terrible et permanente de la cruauté, which Davis translates that indifference to the suffering this world causes which, whatever the name one gives it, is the terrible and lasting form assumed by cruelty. Morris writes to Davis saying that he thinks that Proust intends to make a conceptual and not psychological point about the nature of cruelty. He says, I was unsure why permanente had been translated by you and others as lasting, whatever that might mean, rather than as constant or permanent, either of which would seem better to suggest a salient and defining feature of all forms of cruelty rather than duration. Parsing the differences between conceptual versus psychological definitions of cruelty, a problem with capital consequences in law, medicine, and psychoanalysis, is no simple hair-splitting exercise. Matters of life and death, trauma and recovery, and crime and punishment hinge on how the word cruelty and its qualifiers are rendered. Davis had written to the Proust specialist Eugène Nicole and to her rival translator James Grieve about the translation of the word boule, some say hot rolls, some say hot water bottles, that appears in a passage in which the young narrator is horrified by Françoise, the kitchen maid's cruelty to the chicken and thinks they ought to fire her. But then he wonders who would make him such fragrant coffee. Reading Davis's letter to Grieve together with Morris's letter to her, we see how context, especially including class context in this case, affects how cruelty signifies, and from there, how translation destabilizes universal ethical principles and methods of adjudication within systems of justice. In my talk today, I've read Davis's archive along with those literary works of hers that zoom into the minds and moods of the translator. Taken together, we have a singular yet composite genre, a kind of paraliterature, writing that is marginal or extraneous to the institution of literature, that doubles following Emmanuel Bourgeois as I would say, a kind of epi-translation. Epi-translation in Davis's oeuvre I associate specifically with revelations about the translator's craft, its trade secrets, its tales of woe, and clocked hours of effort. Epi-translation carries a kind of truth value or truth condition insofar as it documents these translator travails. But it also documents a kind of post-truth condition insofar as it shows up the unreliability of the translator, her avowals of perhaps I'm mistaken, which lead the reader to question her decisions or to become hyper-aware of the speculative, hypothetical, unstable nature of translation. Oh, I guess that's yeah, these are just little emails. She has a wonderful text called Letter to a Hotel Manager, published in the collection Canton Monde. The letter concerns what the narrator believes to be a spelling error on a Boston hotel menu, a term meaning, sorry, this does not have to relate to what I'm saying. The letter concerns what the narrator believes to be a spelling error, a term meaning a young cod or catch of the day is spelled with an SCH, so it comes out with a Germanic sounding schrod instead of scrod. The narrator makes it clear to the reader that she's unsure about whether she's right. She writes, I thought this spelling might be right and I must be wrong, since I was here in New England, in Boston, home of the cod and the scrod. I also remember, perhaps wrongly, I had thought, I suppose mistakenly, there are all these terms in this text about the hotel manager. On the second evening, making a connection, perhaps a false one, between this misspelling and the accent with which your restaurant manager addressed my brother and me. So the point is, such phrases, all of this, underscore the degree of hedging that goes on when someone with a translator's eye and ear for the foreignness of words takes a leap of faith into interpreting them through the translational filter. So, my conclusion. In his 1961 book, The Rhetoric of Fiction, the venerable critic Wayne Booth introduced the concept of the unreliable narrator. The unreliable narrator was distinguished by a credibility gap between what he or she presents as true, a sequence of events, a world picture, a subjective experience, and what the reader sees as the truth of the text. So, for example, if you know that the narrator is mentally unstable, you know that what they're narrating is not reliable. Davis, we could say, uses the figure of the unreliable translator as a fulcrum of her fiction, whose genre is what I've been thinking of as a kind of self-deconstructed epi-translation. Epi-translation schools the reader in distrust of the translated text, instead of being reassured that the text they're reading is accountable to optimal measures of accuracy, as in the case of machine translation, the reader must contend with the high probability of human error, but more importantly, with the unfixed relative nature of translational truth. Davis's epi-translation wears a human face and exposes the truth of translation's secret life. It ushers into the open a cast of characters, translators, editors, critics, fellow translators, whose influence on the final product is significant, though largely unseen, as we've seen from that archive. And it takes the reader inside the translator's private mental life, offering a scan, or as I've been calling it, a kind of cognitive realist vision of the decision-making process, a live record of how translation actually happens, at least by humans. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this talk on the secret life of a translator and an epic translation. Thank you again. We can continue in the coffee break if you wish, and we will go on with the next panel at 10 o'clock. So we'll have some time for refreshment. Thank you.